Well, thank you all for being here this morning. We're going to start. We know that people trickle in for these morning events, but we're delighted that you all are here. And we are just delighted to welcome Dr. Randal Jelks, who is Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Kansas. So he has come up from, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know.
Lawrence, Kansas.
Lawrence, Kansas. Any Kansas people in the room? Sorry, it's the deal.
We got John Brown and Langston Hughes. That's not a bad deal.
I grew up in Iowa, and my dad was a big Cornhuskers fan, and we used to play Kansas. So, there's always all this various rivalries around the way. But back to Professor Jelks. He is clergy, a Presbyterian minister, and also a documentary film producer, so we can imagine the quality of our PowerPoint this morning, that someone has the technical, engaged background to be able to provide a depth of engagement.
I'm a producer, not a director.
A producer, not a director. Okay, well, there we are. Okay. But most recently, he wrote this book, Letters to Martin, Meditations of Democracy in Black America. And this is really the theme or the topic that we will be hearing from Professor Jelks today about. The title of his presentation to us this morning is African American Spirituality and the Continuous Struggle for Democracy. This is a live issue in our time, and particularly at this moment in our own history as a nation, and also in many ways the kind of way that we're engaged as a congregation with the questions of who are we as citizens of God's Commonwealth and also citizens of this country. So with no further ado, I would love to welcome Reverend Dr. Jelks. Thank you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. So I have to unmute myself, I assume.
No, you can leave that muted.
Okay, so no.
We're bringing it down here.
Alrighty, thank you. So I think we always want to begin with a little demographics, and I know that's small. But it's still today that African Americans are majority Protestant. That is still the case, 45% being Baptist. And if, can I move over here for a moment?
Oh,
sure. So
If you want to just grab
the microphone. Okay. So African Americans continue to be, thank you, Baptists. A growing portion non-religious, Pentecostal and other Protestant, Methodist, non-denominational, Catholic, and these colors represent that. And I think people don't think about the kind of diversity, both Protestant, Catholic, and Muslim. 35% of all Muslims in the United States are African Americans. And so to think about the kind of religious ways that people look at their existence, and this is very important for our conversation. So I always begin with the European Protestant Reformation. There's the Catholic side of the Reformation, but the Protestants, right? 1517 to 1648. The kind of change in the shape of the European landscape due to the Protestant Reformation. Some of you all will remember that stuff way back. I grew up Lutheran, so in Missouri Synod Lutheran, so I had to learn about the Reformation. Slightly jaded or sided, because the conservative Lutherans, which I grew up in, the Missouri Synod. So we actually were, forced to learn this stuff. But as you go on, it's the shape of Northern Europe shifted. And what's important to understand is that at the same time, the transatlantic slave trade is going on. And people often don't, when I was a theological student, never put those two in parallel, right? So this movement of people is also meaning movement of people in their religious views and the encounter with two different sets of people. So the Atlantic slave trade at the low end brought in 10 million people. At the very highest, it brought in 14 million people. So into the Americas. And most of those were in, of course, South America and the Caribbean, and what became the United States got the least portion of slaves. But we grew our slave population, and that's the difference in the United States. The United States, capitalism, you grow your business, and that's what the United States did. So to understand that these two things are interweaving, intersecting, and in a denomination like our own, lots of slave owners, Scottish, and so that you get in your mind that these two things are not separate. They're not occurring at separate moments. They're interweaving themselves together. And of course, Africa is the second largest continent in the world. I want people, all Americans, don't know geography. Like Mexico is in North America, not South America. Africa is the second largest continent in the world. You can put the United States, you can put China. It is, having lived on the African continent, it is huge. You can't just fly from Accra, Ghana, where I lived, to Joburg. It's 6 hours by flight. So it's a large, massive continent. And Africa has a triple heritage religiously. Indigenous religions all around, right? Christianity is in Africa, because if you read the Bible, you know that Christianity and Judaism were all around the African continent. This is from Ethiopia, the great monasteries dug in the ground, Islam, and again, the indigenous religion. This is a Yoruba ceremony going on here at the bottom. So just to keep in mind that people who were brought into the Americas, not just the United States, in the Americas, brought with them all kinds of religious notions. And we sometimes think they are superstitious because that's what missionaries and everybody in the 19th century said. But these were people's actual religions, just like indigenous nations of North America had own different religions. So this brings us to Black Protestants, and this is very important because by the 18th century in the United States and in the Caribbean, African Americans throughout the British colonies began to reshape what this Protestant movement meant for themselves, and to suit their own needs as an oppressed people, as a people. So Black Protestants begin to suit their own needs, and I always love this picture because my grandmother was baptized in the Mississippi River. And I know the date, 1918, and full immersion, just like this kind of ceremony. She would have been baptized by Reverend Sweet. I even knew that. And I once cheekily asked my grandmother, did the doves come out when you rose from the water? Which I was proceeded to be bopped on the back of the head. Really, a great part of this is that we often think that people didn't retain their own notions and sensibility. Christianity fit around theirs. This is from my home state. I was born in New Orleans, lived there till I was 14. Of course, African retentions of all sorts, and people knew about Africa because that's why you have names like Congo Square, unfortunately the state penitentiary named Angola, Algiers, all around the city of New Orleans. African retentions were always a part of people's lives, and no matter who you are, you create social systems for your pleasure, for your own edifications, and so forth.
I don't
Well, that people retain culture. Yeah, right. They retain culture. They don't cultures. They don't just suddenly like, I'm giving up things. They may hide them. They may suppress them. They may do them, but everybody retains culture, right? And so, and one of the things that's always fascinating for me is the interaction with Baptists. Baptists grew out of the English Reformation. You remember, Henry VIII and his divorce that he had to get, and part of the kind of Baptists wanted full immersions, a little bit different than what we would know as the Congregationalists or the Children of Puritans, right? And the denomination was marked by, and the movement of Baptists were marked by anti-slavery initially, and full immersion baptism. And people of African descent saw that, and many people from parts of Western Africa said this is like our water rights. So this, where the marriage of Baptists and so forth. So by 1788, if you've ever been in Savannah, Georgia, you see the first African Baptist church was organized in 1788. So by the 18th century, you're seeing people organize churches in the Caribbean, Methodists and Baptists together. Of course, Methodism, this is, Charles Wesley. We sing his beer drinking tunes in church, which they were. I mean, the history of both Luther and Wesley learned a mighty fortress is a beer drinking tune. You can just hear it in the, right? A mighty fortress is our God. Our bulwark never failing. Right, it really is. So all the Methodists tuned because that's why they want to reach the working poor, the working men of England, right? And also it was initially anti-slavery. And of course, revivalism, George Whitefield, AKA Dr. Squintum, that's what people called him, going around preaching, but slavery was such big business, and you have to think of it economically. It was such big business that Dr. Squintum eventually would compromise. This is his route. So he preached to slaves, he preached to everybody. And he says, though liberty is a sweet thing to such as are born free, yet to those who never knew the sweets of its, slavery perhaps may not be so irksome. So he is having to negotiate with slave, and of course the kind of revival movement. Nevertheless, African Americans began to convert to Christianity. It was a moral dilemma, and I won't show this from this Amazing Grace. Baptists and Methodists were religiously forefront of the battleground regarding issues of reverence for human life and dignity, but the economic interest overrode other consideration. And I really want to say from the outset that African Americans were doing this for their own reverence of their own selves, not just in response. I think scholars have gotten this a little bit twisted. Although African Americans were not smart enough to figure out that they reverence their own dignity and their own lives. And this is clear in Philadelphia, right? The Free African Society established by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen and other free blacks in 1788. The society's purpose was to support one another in sickness and for the benefit of their widows and fatherless children. This is all organized by African Americans, and this comes to then begin to organize free independent churches. Mother Bethel, established in 1788, founding minister Richard Allen. The famous incident, the first kind of civil rights movement, you want to say, happens in the church. If you go to St. George Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, one of the oldest churches in the city, African Americans were forced in the balcony, to sit in the balcony, and the church wanted them to come up as a separate time to pray. And Absalom Jones and Richard Allen and other people, women of the church, they size it up and they wait till the prayer time and they walk out the church. So in 1787, 1794, and they begin to form their own churches. So the first St. Thomas Episcopal was organized 1794. So with these denominations, so associated with and so forth. And our own tradition, here we're at a Presbyterian church. First African Presbyterians in Philadelphia was established 1807. So most people don't learn this in seminary, unfortunately. They only learn one side, and that's why I'm here. The legacy of Black Presbyterians, and I put these slides in here for you, is very, very important. John Gloucester was the first pastor of First African Methodist Church. John Westworm here, this guy in the middle, was started the first free independent black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, a Presbyterian clergy. Elizabeth Keckley was Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker. She went to 15th Avenue Presbyterian Church in D.C. Henry Highland Garnett, more radical than Frederick Douglass ever was. He declared that slaves should armed revolt, drawing on Scottish Presbyterian doctrine. So, and Lucy Craft Laney, one of the great teachers. So these Presbyterians, because they had access to education, were far more, in some ways, more radical than most. But the biggest denomination became, by black Americans, became the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and as a denomination was founded in 1816. So black people are caring about their own lives. I always chuckle, and I love my young people, but black lives always have mattered to black people. I mean, this is quite evident that they would matter to, and because the AME was a denomination, it then fostered schools and other things around the country, well organized. Black Protestant congregations face what all congregations face, the outset internal sexist politics, right? Who gets to preach? Who gets to be in leadership, And all of these women, Amanda Smith, all of these are asking the same very, very heartfelt question. So you had the distinguished journalist Nicole Hannah Jones here, and so this 1619 project doesn't mention this, and this is my critique of it. Like black people they built their own institutions for themselves, for their own joy, for their own happiness, and so forth, and they had their own politics internally, just like any other denomination. AME minister, bishop will become an AME bishop. Henry McNeil Turner becomes the first U.S. Army chaplain, politician in Georgia, a whole illustrious career. And of course, the Civil War changes everything, and I won't bother with that right now, so we can talk. And then creating civil society after the Civil War, civil society can be built more. And civil society is a social sphere separate from government and economic interests. These are the institutions built by racial ethnic groupings for shared protection, benevolence, charity, and pleasure. So after the Civil War, people are free and they leave primarily white denominations or white churches and form their own. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, the growth of independent black congregations, I was traveling in South Carolina, and all through you will see these small churches, Mississippi, all through the South, and which my great-grandparents were founded a church great-great-great-grandparents founded a church in 1872 after freedom. So, and a school. So people are doing for themselves. So the myth of that people are just waiting for somebody to hand out, no, they built these schools and these institutions with their own hands and for their own purposes. Growth west of the Mississippi, The AME Church, this is a map. It has a whole idea that we're going to map this out and we're going to place churches out there. So where I live, out in Lawrence, this church is a historic church under renovation, the AME Church in Lawrence. And way out west, as you're going toward Colorado, in 1877, Nicodemus, Kansas, black community, a farming community in Nicodemus. You really do have to be a farming community to be out in it. It was founded in 1877. So people are organizing themselves, and because they're organizing themselves, they have their own democratic structures. As urban life comes on, there's more denominationalism and the rise of the black working class. So we begin to see, I'm from New Orleans, so there's huge black Catholic population, right? So Baltimore and New Orleans are kind of sister cities, be more, as some people call it. And Black Catholic Congress, 1892, the first church, St. Francis Xavier, is dedicated 1864. So that you get some idea that this is really important to people. And of course, after this, the National Baptist Convention brings a disparate group of Baptists together to form denomination 7.5 million people. Now, my grandparents on both sides were Baptists. So I had my fair share of Baptist churches going as a kid because my grandparents were Baptists, and although they liked the education the Lutherans provided me, they didn't certainly like as my grandmother said, you really weren't baptized, they just sprinkled you in. Right? So I had to kind of learn Baptist doctrine because my grandparents were heavily involved. This was their social life. And of course, Baptist churches all around the United States sprung up. So these are huge urban churches, and they're rural churches, and people gather, and because they become sites for the betterment of black people. The other thing is the rise of Pentecostalism. This is the Azusa Street revival. And I know Presbyterians, we don't use the body that much, but the Azusa Street mission, it was a pretty radical act because it was intended to be an interracial mission. And this was what got it in trouble. And my fellow Louisianans, the Seymours, this is William Seymour, helps find it. And you can see the early pictures that this revival was supposed to bring God's people as they spoke in tongues and glossolalia and danced together. But in 1906, how dare white people and black people even touch? Or this was a crisis. And of course, we get out of that crisis, we get in Pentecostalism the Assemblies of God and all of these other denominations. The Church of God in Christ, as we affectionately say in black communities, COGIC, the Church of God in Christ, founded in 1907, Bishop Charles H. Mason, 1866 to 1961. The Church of God in Christ is huge. Its headquarters is St. Louis today, but it was Memphis. It was organized in 1907. And Pentecostalism, it was for the poor. I did a talk in Brazil many years ago, and in Rio, and my fellow scholars were like, "Oh, these Pentecostals are all around." I said, "Well, this is actually a global movement started in the American South, in the Delta, among poor people for their own religious benefit." Black religions are international, right? This is George Washington Williams, Reverend George Washington Williams, 1849, 1891. He writes an open letter. He goes to interview the Belgian king and finds out that they're doing such damage in the Congo. And this guy, William Shepherd, one of those black Presbyterians again, is actually put on trial by the Belgian government for libel for writing about the damage, because to get rubber, and if you didn't meet your quota, they cut off your hands. This is true. I'm not making. Adam Hofschild, a good Englishman, wrote a book. This is all, and so he is on a mission with the Cuba people, and he and his family. And so this is really, really important for us to understand what is going on. The Nation of Islam. You're in Chicago. And this is the home of the Nation of Islam. It became so. And one of the reasons Elijah Poole, now it was Elijah Muhammad, knew the Bible better than most people. And in the region of Georgia where he came from, I was just in Montgomery at the Equal Justice Institute's lynching memorial. If you go there, you will note how many people in his area was lynched. So if he called the white man a devil, that had certain rationale, because wholesale terrorism to create a community. But of course, he is trying to build for himself and for his community a reverence. And why would you want to be Christian is his fundamental question. But black churches, because they have buildings, because they have spaces, become places for people to organize. So, and piety is used in the civil rights movement to win people over, saying, what we are trying to do here is be good Christians. What we're trying to do here, that's the late John Lewis and others, what we're trying to do here is to say in the South, where churches are so heavily run every block like the North, what we're trying to do here is be good Christians. I argue sometimes that the death of Martin Luther King Jr. threw black churches in crisis, particularly among young people, because then, like, if you get killed for nonviolence, what won't this nation do to you, right? And so I've been exploring, and this is a book I wrote previously, I've been exploring the kind of black religious pluralism as democratic engagement. What does that mean for people to have faith and also a sense of their own dignity? And finally, I wrote this book because the good Scott Matheny back there invited me to Elmhurst College. And when in 2017, shortly after President Trump was elected into office, and I needed to figure out a way to talk to students, to say something to them about their lives now. I mean, Martin King had been dead almost 50 plus years, and they knew nothing about him. And of course, my parents were the Great Depression babies, so there was no feelings in our house, right? I mean, your parents born in the 30s, it's all about duty. You get up and you do things. They may give you a hug, but not too much, right? I mean, it's about, you better get on with it. So I have a generation of students who feel things. And I was trying to figure out how to talk to them. So I decided that the talk is to use a letter form, and I came up with an idea for a book. And I just want to read you one small passage of the book, and so that you get a sense of where I was going. So I wrote in a chapter called Network of Mutuality, it has been over 50 years since your death, and as you prophesied shortly before your death, our struggles have been difficult. The optimistic dream you exhorted before the Lincoln Memorial, in hindsight, seems sometimes even Kafkaesque. Your dream was a burdensome responsibility. You realized that it was more systematic than personal and made up of more structural consideration than individual expressions. And today, the battles in our streets are even more explicitly about corporate economic disparities, and militarized police departments who enforce a rule of law to protect power, not people. Martin, you would be surprised to know that there are still too many Bull Connors on our streets who carry out their brutality with the blessings of governors, judges, mayors, and robber barons. All attempt to corral our resistance using intimidation and force as though our humanity does not count. However, as you knew, and I know too, our lives have always mattered. This has been the religious indoctrination instilled in us. We are all God's children. This has been our great spiritual equalizer, and it has followed us in our histories. It is profoundly democratic. You were my parents' generation, and it would have been impossible for me to call you by your first name in your lifetime. I was a child and you were an adult, and I was born 10 months after the Montgomery bus boycott began. I was witness, participant, and beneficiary of the unfolding drama called the Civil Rights Movement. Strange as it may seem, as a youngster, I felt an intimacy with you as I do today. Call it our network of mutuality. The mutuality for me came in my adolescence. So I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much. And if you have questions, can be kind of a dialogue, but I do want to do a shout out to my friend Scott Matheny, who is right in the third row back. And Scott and I were seminary classmates at Princeton Seminary and have had a long connection through our work in chaplaincy. So thank you again, Scott, for your support of bringing our guest today. So let's have a conversation. It can either be about some of the history. That was a very quick history from 0 to 1,000 here. But do you have questions or comments or some way to engage? Reagan and then Marilyn, and it does help, even though, actually, it doesn't look like we have anybody online, which may have been a little miss on advertising. So, but it is helpful sometimes to have the mic
Sure.
so you can do it.
What?
With that.
Seems like there are not that many people here, and really I just want to ask you. First of all, thank you very much. Some of this, of course, I knew, and what I appreciated about the 1619 publications was the conventions of black men before the freedom of the slaves. I just didn't know anything like that. So those institutions, and which lived on and live on till today, I was stunned by that and still am. So I appreciate this about the churches, particularly because I've been a church goer my entire life. Not always a Presbyterian, but more Presbyterian than a Catholic, say. And so, but I love this, also the little bit about the Pentecostalism and how that spread worldwide and began here, you know, with poor blacks. And there's other, of course, there's a lot of other influences. But the one influence that I don't see in the Presbyterian churches is the influence of political activism. I mean, we have some here, you know, but it's not, we're not like a church that's out there against guns or, you know, for gun, you know, we're not like, it seems that white Presbyterian churches are not doing that in a way. Well, yeah, maybe I was. I have a feeling I was on the South Side in '67 several times, but at any rate, and you know, sometimes I think it's just because I'm more politically active than anything else. So maybe you could address that.
Yeah, sure. Well, no, I mean, Presbyterians, depending on the Presbyterian church, of course, it all depends on the congregation you're in. You know, if one is working downtown Presbyterian church, that's the audience it's going to serve. If you're on the far south side, as I was, as a student of McCormick, a real seminary, and the reason I went to McCormick was because it was in the middle of the city. so I could learn about different kinds of ministries all going on in the city. So it was a learning laboratory. So politics is always in the eye of the beholder. It's done differently in different spaces, and all congregations everywhere have their own internal politics, so what you can and cannot do, and so forth. And they represent different interests. But they also represent ways people can talk to each other around different issues. And that's, so, I mean, while in my day, Reverend Davies, Elam Davies was here, I wouldn't come to church here, but we could talk and about different things. And of course, Fourth has been a leader in social services to people in the old days when there was a Cabrini Green and other kinds of things. So we all do it differently. So I want to make sure that and have different kinds of conversations about how that could happen. So forth. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history of the Baptist Church, and I was, there seems to be a schism, if you want to put it, with the Southern Baptist.
Well, I mean, all of the churches, including the Presbyterian Church, everybody split over slavery. So throughout the United States, the church split over slavery. There's no Methodist, Baptist, everybody. Slavery was the big bugaboo in the United States. You remember, by the end of the Civil War, there are roughly 4 million people enslaved. So this is this is a troublesome thing for the United States. So the Baptists, Black Baptists, want their own. In many southern cities, slaves went to church where their ownership, and they sat in a balcony. And on larger plantations, there would be slave preachers come out to preach, but they had to be, slaves be obedient to your master, that emphasized. I mean, Christianity is born in a slave society. Nobody should ever kid themselves about the Roman Empire. Roughly 10 million people were enslaved in the Roman Empire. And it was not a different kind of slavery. Slavery is slavery. You brutalize people to make them enslaved. And so this is important for us to know. Paul is trying to find wiggle room in the epistles to the Romans about the issue of slavery. He says, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. And I always wrote in my margins, yeah, Paul, you were, but you were Roman citizens, and all those other people, what are they to do, and so forth. So, these are issues of human exploitation, and we continue with that. So the Baptists, back to the Baptists, Black Baptists form their own, and of course, just like everybody else, there are politics within the Black Baptist Church. Martin Luther King Jr. was a prince of the Black Baptist Church. I mean, he came from a prominent family church, line of preachers. He was, and of course, he had people, Joseph H. Jackson right here in Chicago at Olivet Baptist Church, a huge Baptist church at one time, totally disagreed with King. And when the street was named after Martin Luther King Jr., he changed the address of the church. So I mean, the politics, there are politics, every denomination has politics. They're most interesting things, right? I mean, we talk about LGBTQ issues, but that issue started in '79 in San Diego in the Presbyterian Church and went on forever and ever and ever. And it was a hard-fought debate, and people moved on from the denomination. These are the realities of churches. They're deeply human institutions. Yeah. Question? Yes. Sure.
This is probably more of a history question, but as you may or may not know, Fourth Church is the recent sponsor of a refugee family that just arrived about 2 weeks ago. and the husband is from the Ivory Coast, and the wife is from Cameroon, and they have 2 children, and they are Christian. So I asked the husband, you know, what type of, I said, there's a wide range of Protestant churches in the U.S. What type of church did you go to? And the only answer he can give me is evangelical. So my question for you is, what was the predominant missionary, in your opinion, in that, you know, Western Africa? They're quite young. They're in their late 20s, early 30s.
Well, Cameroon really is burgeoning on Central Africa, and of course, a large Presbyterian mission was in Cameroon, but the kind of evangelical movement went on all through West Africa, again, internal to itself, not just the missionary movement, internal to itself. The gentleman from Cote d'Ivoire, all young, and of course, if you go on any West African television, you're going to see sort of revivalist style preaching now in various languages. So, but there, like in Ghana, there's a large Presbyterian church, even larger Catholic church, and Methodist church. So this sort of pattern has come to West Africa, even I would argue, kind of partly out of Black American life, this kind of Americanization of churches. Better dancing though. Every African church in West Africa I've been to, you don't take the offering, just you got to dance up the aisle. That's all right with me. Yeah.
So since you've written this great book, how has your life changed, Doctor?
No, well, I'm doing more talks, but this book really came out of, I wanted to think about democracy because I think that all my scholar friends, they write these tomes in philosophy and history, but I would dare argue, maybe the Chinese, but I would dare argue that no other group of people have faced the questions of democracy more frequently than Black Americans. I mean, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan essentially took over politics, right? And of course, and they get their revival in the Midwest, right, in Indiana, and not in the Deep South. But I think that I wanted to write a book from a perspective about democracy that incorporated Black Americans' thought about. And I thought because I had spoken to the students at Elmhurst, no other way was to speak to the issues from a different perspective. And I wanted to write something hopeful. I wanted to write something to the heart. So this book has allowed me to talk to a lot of different audiences, from students. I was just in Oklahoma City on Thursday talking to with an interview kind of format with a city council person. So it's allowed me to have all kinds of conversations with a variety of people. And my goal is to help folks think about the future and using this kind of epistolary format to do that. My life was pretty good, so I can't complain about that. I mean, it was pretty good. I'm a university professor. I have to deal with university types. That can be challenging. But in the scale of my grandfather, who carried luggage for 40 years at the New Orleans train station, my life's pretty good. So I'll take that. But I really want to end the conversation with people, all kinds of people, to talk about you can't have democracy without having an internal sense of being democratic yourself.
It seems to me that in about 2 weeks that the entire
black population is going to be disenfranchised from voting. I'm really concerned about it. I mean, in Atlanta and Phoenix and Houston.
Right. It's not just black people, and I think you all, everybody should realize this. It's not just black people. The United States is being Jim Crowed or Jane Crowed in a different kind of way. The elderly, whether your name change, all kinds of ways people can inhibit voting. Now, I'm not as despairing as you, because been that, done that, and ready for the fight. I mean, that's just going to be what it is. I mean, and it's very confusing, right? You have Senator Warnock running against Herschel Walker. People can say Mr. Walker's a pawn. Those are his beliefs. I disagree with them. Or you have Justice Thomas. Both these men are Georgians on the Supreme Court. And the new recent justice. But, we can't, I'm not despairing about that, Again, this long history provides me with, we're in a struggle, all of us, to make a better world. And you got to enter into the struggle. And people who are religious or go to church on Sunday have to enter into the struggle too. What ways will we make our city better? When I was a seminarian, I worked for the first campaign of Harold Washington. And that was my way of making this town better. Is it better? No. In some ways it is, though. I'm here. I'm speaking. I'm talking to you all. So I take that as a sign that it is better. You have a woman mayor, second woman mayor, Jane Byrne, and then now your mayor who's openly queer. So that's okay. We got lots of fights about this out here, but we shouldn't despair. And you shouldn't believe the headlines of the New York Times, because, papers and MSNBC or whatever you watch, CNN, because they are trying to get you to watch their show, and you despair reading their headlines. And there are some despairing things to think about. But that's not the only reality going on. And if you listen, and of course Chicago doesn't even have a good paper anymore. Right? So, so it's the local issues, because what happens is political struggles. Remember, who would have thought a great revolution would start in Montgomery, Alabama? So I'm not despairing. And that's why I wrote the book, because I think it's about hope and about young people engaging and trying to learn how to analyze problems. There are all kinds of ways to fix things. And fixing is, as a good reform thinker, is always going. It's ever going on, because people like power. And they want to aggrandize power. So I'm very, very. So one of my friends says, "You sound too hopeful." And I'm like, "Look, my grandparents were born in 1898, 1906, between 1898 and 1906. The horror that they experienced it was real. In small southern towns, that was real. And the Jim Crow experience, so that's my strength. If they can make it through, I always tell my adult children, if they can make it through, we will make it through also. Prayer, that's why, this theme of, one, they revered themselves. I'm a child of God, and that meant something for them. And so it should mean something for us as well here in the Presbyterian Church. Other questions? I know y'all worried, but don't worry. Keep fighting the good fight. And I really want to say we should uplift one another in all that we do. And I wouldn't say that in a university setting, because people are like, well, you're interjecting religion. But spirituality, whatever that means to you, we have to use that as a tool. Because maybe it's the household I lived in, but I never saw myself as marginal. I never saw myself as not worthy, because as they preached in my house, we God's children, or my grandmother would put who lived in the house with us, everybody put on their drawers the same way, one leg at a time. And that image, really gets you like, well, okay, yeah, we're all human, and that's really important for us to impart. And so many young people are living in anxiety and fear. And what's the good news coming out? And that's what I was trying to do in this book, write some hard things, but also some important things that I think it's a long tradition of people trying to engage. And along the way, there's joy. And we don't talk enough about joy in this age where we get, our phones are dinging us and all of this other stuff. But, somewhere a child's being baptized, there's a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah. So something's going on good in the world. Yes, in Ukraine it's horrible. It's even worse in Ethiopia right now because there's a virtual civil war that is not being covered. There are all kinds of things that are horrible going on in the world. But there are also people who are doing good and just things. And we have to emphasize that. It's not always going to take out all of the hard work. Nations aggrandize. There are powerful interests going on. That's a reality. And there needs to be challenges. Like you all, again, invited Nicole Hannah-Jones. That's really important. And you invited me. So that, I'm sort of doing the tail end of that work. But let me say something about Nicole's project. I kind of chuckle at it because that project really came out of Chicago. Lerone Bennett Jr. was the senior editor at Ebony magazine, wrote a book called Before the Mayflower. And every Chicago black kid on the South Side, see, y'all don't hang out in the South Side. Where I went to high school, we moved from New Orleans to Chicago. And where I went, we all carried it in our backpack. And he begins with 1619 as the moment of this history starting. So Before the Mayflower wasn't, white folks, y'all didn't even know nothing about that. Because that was Ebony magazine, and Johnson Publishing published that book, and every kid, this is why I became, in my dedication, is one to Lerone, because Mr. Bennett really inspired me. He wrote history pieces in Ebony magazine. And I said, the prose is so beautiful. I want to learn how to write like that. My English teachers wanted me to too, as well. So I think that, we have to make these connections. Chicago, it's in 1963, there was a big protest here in Chicago. If you're around 63, black parents took their kids out of school, and that started on October 22nd in 1963. And this is what one of the issues, Benjamin Willis was the president of the school board then, about education. We've got work to do about public education. And this is a really important democratic thing. We still have to have a standard of educating our children and a common standard on some things. People can disagree about whether I went to parochial school, I understand, but there still has to be some common standard about what we learn. And now, in my all-black Lutheran church, and I thought all Lutherans looked like me, I did. I actually thought, because everybody, I was telling Scott, my home congregation in New Orleans is 135 years old. So I thought all Lutherans looked like me till I went to a big youth gathering, and I was like, where did all these blonde people with glasses come from? So the real important thing is for us to just remember that there is people are building lives and institutions for themselves, and we should be talking to them. It's unfortunate that, you know, many of the churches on the South Side have disbanded, or been disbanded. Presbyterian Church, a long history of that. And that's because of the economic change. Most of the people who worked there were the working class or coming up from working class. So the change in manufacturing, the change in all of those things affected those churches deeply. So we think about the whole range of life in people. Thank you so much for this morning.
Thank you.